Hello, and welcome to today's event on addressing the data divide in the United States. My name is Jillian Diebold, and I'm a policy analyst at the Center for Data Innovation. The Center for Data Innovation is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank focusing on the intersection of data, technology, and public policy. Today, we're going to discuss the data divide, or the social and economic inequalities that result from a lack of collection or use of data about certain individuals and communities. While advances in technology have made it cheaper and easier than ever to produce, collect, and use data, some groups lack high-quality data about themselves. This can hinder their ability to benefit from data-driven innovation and to fully participate in the data economy. I recently released a report on this topic, linked below and available on our website, datainnovation.org, that finds that in a data-driven economy, the extent to which individuals and communities are able to collect data and put it to productive use helps determine everything from health outcomes to public safety and economic growth. I walk through a number of examples, from demographic and geographic data gaps to instances of inequitable data systems in fields like healthcare, education, financial services, etc. For example, many states do not have systems to collect and store robust longitudinal data about students, and as a result, families and leaders lack information about the link between certain educational programs and their outcomes. Likewise, the census undercounts American Indians and Alaska Natives, leading to insufficient and ineffective resource allocation for broadband on tribal reservations. I find that data divides need to be prioritized by policymakers if we hope to prevent certain communities from falling behind. The goal of today's discussion is to unpack data divides and digital inequalities and get a sense of how to tackle this problem and ensure that data-driven innovation positively impacts all communities. This is meant to be an open discussion, so for those watching online, you can submit and vote on questions using Slido. If you're watching on our website, you can find the link below the video. And if you're on one of the other streaming platforms, you can find the link in the video description. Now I'd like to turn things over to Denise Ross for some keynote remarks. Denise is the Chief Data Scientist of the United States. She has spent the last 20 years of her career in data for the public good, including nearly 15 years in New Orleans, which included using data to chart an equitable path to recovery and resilience. Thanks for being here, Denise. Over to you.
Thank you, Jillian, and thank you to the Center for Data Innovation and for hosting me today, and especially for keeping the momentum on this issue of the data divide over the years, including the report that you just released on closing the data divide. As you mentioned, I'm the Chief Data Scientist of the United States. The purpose of the Chief Data Scientist is to responsibly unlock the power of data to benefit all Americans. The operative word here, of course, is in benefiting all Americans. One thing I've noticed in the last 20 years of my career in data is that we often tend to take the data we have for granted or just accept it without thinking about what's missing. Whatever the quality is, how frequently or infrequently it's released, and how much detail it gives about one's community. We take it as we get it, just as is. And that reminds me of something you might have heard before, and that's the streetlight effect. It goes something like this. A passerby sees a man searching for something under a streetlight and asks what he's looking for. The man says he lost his keys, and they both look under the streetlight together. After a few minutes, the passerby asks if he's sure he lost them there. And the man replies, "No, I lost them over in the park." The passerby asks, "Well, why then are you searching over here?" And the man replies, "Well, this is where the light is." We often get lazy like the man who lost his keys, only looking where the available data are for answers we're seeking. But using only the data we have can mask important aspects of our society. A few examples. Data about hazardous air quality from a week of intense wildfires disappears when you look at the annual average air quality. Data on how students perform on standardized tests for reading and math doesn't tell us how many young people are not taking the tests and may have completely disengaged from the educational system during the pandemic. And a city's greenhouse gas inventory might include carbon emissions from buildings, power plants, and vehicle miles traveled. But if it doesn't include the embedded carbon emissions in the goods and services that people in the city continue to consume, products made in polluting factories and transported by polluting modes, then we have an incomplete view of the emissions caused by the full range of their actions. I started my career in data in New Orleans, and when the failure of the federal levee system flooded 80% of the city during Katrina, we saw the pre-existing disparities expand dramatically. It became my role, both in the nonprofit sector and later inside of local government, to use data broken down by race, geography, gender, and other attributes to help chart a path toward an equitable recovery. Sometimes disaggregated data exist and can be valuable for informing policies and programs. Sometimes the data don't exist, and so decisions are made without the complete set of evidence we need. But one thing we know for sure, and that was laid bare recently with the pandemic, is that crises always exacerbate pre-existing disparities across racial, ethnic, gender, and other lines. And those disparities widen even further when you use an intersectional lens and look, for example, at outcomes for Black trans men or low-income girls with disabilities. If we want to design policies and programs that truly result in equitable outcomes, we need to have a clear sense of where the disparities are. President Biden cares deeply about creating a nation in which everyone has equal opportunities. On his first day in office, he launched an ambitious whole-of-government agenda through something called the Executive Order on Advancing Racial Equity and Support for Underserved Communities through the federal government. In that executive order, he wrote that, quote, "A first step to promoting equity in government action is to gather the data necessary to inform that effort," close quote. So that requires collecting and analyzing disaggregated data, which matters because without publicly accessible disaggregated data, acute disparities in our society are obscured, and many marginalized groups remain invisible in government programs and policymaking decisions. The truth, though, and you all know this as well as we do, is that federal data are not often available by race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, income, region, veteran status, or other crucial demographic variables. And for that, we need to bridge the data divide. We can acquire disaggregated data by compiling information from multiple data sources or by collecting new data, all of which can measurably improve the lives of Americans who have been historically left behind. So that's why the Biden-Harris administration established something we call the Equitable Data Working Group as part of his executive order on equity. The working group's vision is to expand collection of and access to disaggregated data to serve the needs of all underserved communities while always robustly protecting privacy. Over the last year and a half, this working group helped us identify shortcomings in the data collection infrastructure and set a strategy to improve equitable data practices in the federal government. To meet this goal, the working group consulted a range of community advocates, experts, and academic researchers who shared crucial insights. And this April, they released recommendations from their work. One of the best things they did in this report was to define what equitable data means. I'd like to take a minute to unpack the term equitable data. So equitable data are those that allow for rigorous assessment of the extent to which government programs and policies yield consistently fair, just, and impartial treatment of all individuals. And most importantly, and this is what really drives me professionally, these data illuminate opportunities for targeted actions that will result in demonstrably improved outcomes for underserved communities. So this isn't just about data for data's sake. This is about turning data into action that results in more equitable outcomes for the American people. Overall, for the federal government to achieve our vision for equitable data, the working group recommended that we do 5 things. And I just like to lay them out so you know where we're coming from. The first is, no surprise, make disaggregated data the norm while we're robustly protecting privacy. Equitable data almost always comes down to disaggregating the data, slicing and dicing it so we can see patterns of who's included and who's left behind. But federal data sets often don't account for the key demographic variables that we need. And these data sets are often totally ill-equipped to honor the complexities of people's identities and to enable identifying disparities so we can remedy them. So that's why at the base of all of this work is disaggregating data. The second recommendation is to catalyze existing federal infrastructure to leverage underused data. This recommendation comes down to not overburdening people with forms that ask questions that we as the federal government already have answers for, just somewhere else. It's incumbent upon us to figure out how to responsibly share and link data sets in order to be able to apply demographic characteristics to records. One way to address the data divide is to make better use of the data that's already been collected. The third recommendation was to build capacity to robustly assess equity and policymaking and program implementation. And when we talk about capacity, I think of it as both about talent and technical infrastructure. And at this point, I think the technical infrastructure is pretty straightforward, but it's worth acknowledging that the field of data science is not as diverse and representative as it needs to be. The number one thing that you need for data science is a complete team. That means diverse skill sets coupled with diverse lived experience that reflects the communities that you're trying to measure. And so having a complete representative data team is a critical path to addressing the data divide. Another way we can accomplish this, and this technical capacity, both on the infrastructure and the human capital side, is by carving out resources for data staffing and technical infrastructure. For example, with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law or the American Rescue Plan, building out data capacity is sometimes explicitly recommended for recipients of the funding, but more often than not, it's just not prohibited. But that means it's okay to spend the money, to spend a part of the money to help build out your data capacity so you can produce these disaggregated numbers that we need. What we find is that when a state or local government builds capacity for data in one arena, say tackling the opioid crisis, they're often able to repurpose that infrastructure and those lessons learned to the next shocks and stressors that come their way, whether it be COVID or an extreme weather event. The fourth recommendation was to galvanize diverse partnerships across levels of government and the research community. The disparities that we face as a society cannot be solved by federal government alone. That's why it's so important to reduce the barriers for state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, researchers, practitioners, and advocates to access disaggregated data with tiered levels of access to protect privacy as necessary, so that they all have access to the information they need so they can align their efforts to reduce disparities. It's really an all hands on deck endeavor, and we need a common base of shared information. We also need input from the public on what data are most valuable to inform advocacy, policymaking, and resource allocation. The last recommendation is always be accountable to the American public. Having really come into my own professionally during the open data movement, started in the Obama administration. This is really, we've seen the power of what data transparency can do in terms of aligning efforts, especially at the local level. And data transparency and accountability are the foundation of building trust in government programs and services. So data transparency gives us a common baseline to start from, even when it shows that we have a lot of work to do to narrow those gaps. It won't come as any surprise to you that I'm going to have a call to action at the end, because we can't do this alone. So I wanted to leave you with a few ways that you can get involved. The first is by joining us in federal government. If you are an early career data professional, check out the U.S. Digital Corps as a way to serve your country. Applications for the next cohort should open in the next couple of months. That's the U.S. Digital Corps. If you're further along in your career, consider a tour of duty in the U.S. Digital Service, 18F, or as a Presidential Innovation Fellow. The Digital Service and 18F jobs are open on a rolling basis, and the next round of Presidential Innovation Fellow applications opens next summer. I personally began my career in federal government as a Presidential Innovation Fellow, and I currently work closely with Presidential Innovation Fellows and U.S. Digital Corps Fellows. And I also get to work with many amazing data practitioners who've made their career in federal government. So I encourage you to also keep an eye out for good government jobs at usajobs.gov, and also local jobs. My data work in New Orleans was some of the most satisfying that I've ever done. Really great team, and so awesome to work so closely with the public on data issues. So keep an eye out for good government jobs working with data, and especially if you're passionate about closing this data divide. And one word of caution here is don't be deceived by how boring all of our job titles are. The jobs themselves are way more interesting than the way we typically sell them when we post them. My second call to action here is to take advantage of opportunities to inform federal data processes. There are a few of these on the table right now that I wanted to let y'all know about. For example, this chief statistician of the United States just announced a series of listening sessions on modernizing the categories for race and ethnicity. The first one is being held September 15th, and you can also sign up to learn about other opportunities to give input on these really critical standards. These listening sessions and the revised race and ethnicity categories, that's updating Statistical Policy Directive 15, if you're following that, they're super relevant to the recommendation in the recent Center for Data Innovation report on closing the data divide, that recommendation to ensure comparable data collection and monitoring methodologies among government and civil society. These standards on race and ethnicity, you see them propagate across state and local government and nonprofits. And so if we can get those right at the federal level, it will help with that type of comparability that really makes the data come alive. Similarly, my shop in Office of Science and Technology Policy, our subcommittee on equitable data, which is the next generation of that that equitable data working group that I mentioned earlier. We just released a request for information on how to best build the federal evidence agenda for LGBTQI plus equity. This is one really concrete place where we can address an extensive data gap. Right now, the federal government is missing consistent, robust data on the experiences of LGBTQI people in housing and homelessness, healthcare, criminal justice, public benefits, employment, foster care services, you name it. The need for evidence is clear, but we need your feedback on where to get started. A colleague of mine told me a story about recent research related to transgender people and voter enfranchisement. There had been a survey several years ago that asked transgender respondents if they had ever had trouble voting because they didn't have an ID that matched their gender. A number of respondents said that they had trouble, and for years, advocates in the LGBTQI community cited ID access as a major barrier to voting for transgender folks. Now, just a couple of years ago, another survey asked the question, but in a different way. It simply asked transgender respondents what had prevented them from casting a ballot in the last election. This time, not having required ID was cited, but a much larger number of respondents said they were prevented from casting a ballot due to a prior felony conviction. When they looked beyond the streetlight, to use that metaphor from the beginning, advocates were able to see another piece of the problem and had the opportunity to refocus their efforts to address an even bigger barrier to civic participation. So in this request for information, we are asking for your input on how to make sure we are shining the light on the disparities you most want to address. We can't solve these data gaps without your help. Over the next few months, we'll be asking for more input from people like you all on how to fill this data divide and responsibly infuse equitable data into the business of government. I also want to assure you that when we host these listening sessions or issue requests for information on this topic, it's because we really want to hear from you. The realm of equitable data is so broad that we do need to tap into the wisdom and experience of those outside government to help us shape the work. Probably the easiest way to stay informed on this issue, if you're interested, is to follow my White House Twitter account at Denise Ross 46. That's Denise with a C. I just tweeted about the listening sessions on race and ethnicity categories and also the sexual orientation and gender data request for information. So again, thank you for having me today. And even more importantly, thank you for moving forward this important work to reduce the data divide.
Thank you so much for that, Denise. I think you really offer an important perspective, especially with that streetlight effect kind of metaphor, using, the idea of using only the data that we have really masks these wider problems and sort of shows us why we always need to strive for better data and to take concrete action like those outlined by that equitable data working group. You bring up a lot of themes that I'm really excited to get into with our panel. So to move into that portion of our program, we have a really great lineup of panelists today. First, we have Dr. Dominique Harrison, Director of Racial Equity Design and Data Initiative at City Ventures Innovation. We have Christopher Wood, Executive Director of LGBT Tech. We also have Dr. Tracy Morris, the Executive Director of the American Indian Policy Institute at Arizona State University. And lastly, we have Ioana Tanase, an Accessibility Program Manager at Microsoft. Thanks to all of you for being here today. And I think, Dominique, I was hoping you could start us off broadly by explaining how data collection and access impacts opportunities for individuals and communities.
Yeah, well, I think that Denise said a lot, really great information about the importance of the kinds of data that is needed to enable equitable outcomes for communities. But, what I thought was really interesting, when reading your report and also listening to her is that, a lot of what Denise was talking about is data for, based on the population that could be used to dictate policies and programs and government. But there are other industries where data or personal information is collected that may not have equitable outcomes or may be misused. And so when we think about data being used in the consumer marketplace to dictate goods and services, information about, what you buy or what kind of websites you visit, et cetera, can be used in harmful ways, and it can impact specifically communities that are excluded from having opportunities to participate in the consumer marketplace. So I think, it's important to think through what are the challenges and opportunities there that exist and how companies use data. But I am definitely a champion for being able to have more information from specific communities to be able to develop programs and resource allocation that is necessary to advance these communities. And I know we'll talk about a lot of other things as it relates to this, but specifically also thinking about some of the privacy challenges or the ways in which data is stored that can cause more harmful effects for specific communities.
For sure. Would anyone else like to add anything?
Thank you so much. And Dominique, I completely agree with you, especially for, and great to see you on a different panel. But especially for LGBTQ communities, for so long, I think it's important to underscore the fact that a lot of times data in any form, even before computers, was used really against our community, and in many ways is still being used against our community, especially if you're across other minorities. The LGBTQ community is not a monolith and can belong to many different minority communities at once, as Denise mentioned, Black trans men and how disproportionate they are in access to technology first and foremost, and then therefore not really counted or included in so many opportunities across the board, of which I know we'll get into. But I think that's really important to underscore that many minority communities, especially the LGBTQ community, have long felt and feel the pain of having their data used against them in very harmful ways.
One thing I would offer on top of Chris's comments as well, and a lot of my responses today will have the disability angle through the nature of my job. And when we're talking about disability especially, it is often said by the community that they feel invisible. And one of the reasons they feel invisible is the lack of data to serve their needs in society, to serve their needs in the workplace. Across the board, it's a common feeling. And to Chris's point, there, it's not a monolith where we have intersectional elements to it, and that only accentuates the feeling in the community where data is missing, or more importantly, where data is misrepresenting as well.
I would just like to echo everyone. Just feel like echo. But in Indian country, our data has most definitely been used against us. And so therefore we've avoided the collection of data. So we're misrepresented in the census pretty significantly, but there's lots of other facets to that. Currently in Indian country, there's a movement towards data sovereignty and owning our data. So lots to talk about today. I look forward to the conversation.
Great. I think it would be helpful maybe if we take a step back, and I think Tracy just sort of touched on it a bit, but I'd like to maybe go around and just identify, where do you all see data divides in your work? Maybe a specific example or two, just for our audience to sort of situate, really what we're talking about within your specific areas. If Chris, you want to start, maybe.
Sorry about that. So I think I'm going to caveat this with the fact that the LGBTQ community has been one of the most understudied, although I recognize our Native American communities, tribal communities are also very understudied, or similarly, LGBTQ have not wanted to be studied before fear of it would be outing them or in some way damaging them. So I think one of the things that we've seen is just the amount of knowledge we've been able to gain since the move towards equal rights here in the country, not full equal rights, but some, is that we realize how much information we are missing about our community. And I think this goes back to specifically when OMB passed the fact that for same-sex couples, contractors had to treat them fairly under the Obama administration. I think standing in that line and talking to some of the data professionals then, we began to really understand how information around healthcare and broader healthcare data sets were actually able to help and serve the LGBTQ community in a greater way, but fearful that that information would be used against them as it has in the past. But also things around healthcare, things around housing, things around communities of color who may not identify as gay or lesbian, but maybe more like men who have sex with men, who identify very differently and don't identify as gay. And so I think there's a lot of subsets within our community where we are seeing opportunities to collect data. And when that data is given, we are actually able to help a broader set of individuals. But I think we have a really long way to go in collecting this data. But I'm really glad to see administrations like Denise, like the Obama administration, the Biden administration, really trying to include and continue to advance the collection of that data.
I can talk about tribal real quick. So I work with tribal communities, Native American communities, and I think it's hard to wrap your head around how big the divide is because we're talking about 574 distinct tribal governments, and we're part of the family of governments of the United States. So the data divide is so significant because states don't deal with our data, the Fed does. So you end up with these jurisdictional issues that create large gaps. So if you're looking at that many tribes, how do you even assess them? They're not comparable in terms of language, location, customs, or any of that. So it's 574 governments. So that's the first issue with the data divide. Certainly, I think of a couple of examples that have been real significant. Of course, I work in broadband, so broadband's a big issue. And actually trying to construct studies that would get that granular data is just an absurd exercise. We've managed to get some representative studies, but they're small. And census is never going to take care of that. FCC data is not going to take care of that. The new fabric maps aren't going to take care of that. But the other area where we've seen the data divide be significant in impacting lives is with the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples. Because of the jurisdictional issues between state, city, county, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Department of Interior, tribal government, multiple tribal governments, you can have just a jumble of whose jurisdiction is it. And that's only being exacerbated by recent Supreme Court rulings in Oklahoma. So the data divide impacts real people's lives. And that's one of the reasons that Native women are so trafficked, is because folks know we're not being tracked. There's no way to find that information. So between broadband and MMIP, I've been astounded by the data divide in Indian country.
I'm happy to go next. And apologies, my cat is in the background deciding to make a presence. Typical. In my world, I would say I'll try to give a really high-level overview, and then I'll make it concrete with a couple of examples. As we talk about disability, we don't currently have a pulse on how many people around the world have a disability. There's a number that is commonly used. It's around 1 billion people have a disability, but that's an old number. There are so many new considerations that haven't been taken into account. Mental health being one, long COVID being another. We simply don't have a grasp of how big the scale of disability is. We presume and we estimate, but there's no accurate number. And obviously that has real life impact. How governments take decisions when it concerns policy, how nonprofits choose to focus on certain issues, how companies operate, it all gets impacted. And then to make it really practical, my formal hat, I was a recruiter. There's a whole trend around automated hiring tools, right? And using AI and data for automatic hiring tools. And one of the real life risks is really sustaining biases in hiring through automated AI, because we know that people with disabilities are more affected by unemployment. We know that they encounter real life biases in the recruitment processes. So if the data is not there and the AI models are not actually inclusive of people with disability, they can actually sustain issues and even deepen the disability divide when it comes to unemployment of people with disabilities.
Yeah, so I'd like to talk about, data divide in like the tech space and then the financial industry. I mean, I think, Dr. Morris spoke to it in terms of broadband. You need that information to understand who does and does not have access in order to be able to develop programs or policies to ensure that those communities have equitable access. So that's a very important, work that people have been advocating for. When I think about, data or information on race in terms of how companies hire and employ specific communities, I think that's important. The EEOC was once collecting data on the advancement and number of communities of color who are employed at tech companies. That information is important so we can be able to say how are tech companies doing as it relates to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to be able to hold them accountable for being able to employ and advance folks across their staffing. So I think those are important things to look at as well. When I think about the financial services industry, in which I've occupied just recently, I think about credit invisible. So that is the lack of history, credit history for communities of color and other. And I think there are a number of reasons why we've gotten there based on banking and lending companies not being able to communicate and provide the services needed to those specific communities. And so those communities have opted out of wanting to be a part of the banking system. So that's an issue, that we think about. And then I say a bit of an example of more data or lack of data around underbanked and unbanked and diverse segments, again, in the financial services industry. And this is important because develop products and services to meet the needs of those kind of segments. We need information about their perspectives and their habits and behavior. But again, I caution this kind of data that's used by companies and others because we have seen the harmful effects. At the same time, it's important to understand what those communities may be experiencing in their access and use of technologies. So I applaud folks or companies like Facebook, who is now starting to collect race data to understand how their technology may be impacting communities differently, or folks like JP Morgan, who wants to collect race on specific products and services to be able to understand how different communities access their kind of products and services. So it's a twofold thing in which I see in terms of the importance of data, but the ways in which it can be misused.
Definitely. And I think there's obviously, you're all kind of touching on this core tension between, obviously more data will create a better technology, but, there's all these historical and present problems that come with that kind of data collection. I'm kind of curious, maybe Ioana can elaborate on this of what types of data specifically will help us build more accessible and inclusive technology. And I guess I'm also kind of interested in thinking about data beyond just federal statistics, obviously extremely important for policymaking, but I think we need to think about data in terms of, sensor-based data, Internet of Things, all of that types of things. So I'm kind of curious, what kind of information or data do we need really in order to build that better technology, so to speak?
This can be a long answer, but I'll try my best to be succinct. First of all, I think there needs to be principles around the data, and we kind of touch upon those, but really data for the sake of data is not going to help. So it has to have certain principles behind it, and it has to be usable. It has to empower those that it's meant for. It has to be secure, and it has to be private. Those are kind of the four ethoses, if you will, when it comes to data. and open data especially. I also think it needs to be in partnership, because what we're seeing is there's these monoliths of building data, right? So, but we need to really put together across industry, government, civil societies, if you will, around the world in order to build data. Now, back to your point of what type of data can be useful. Again, it varies, but we can talk about census, and we can talk about how for people with disabilities, the census addresses questions about disability. That's not always consistent, or it doesn't necessarily follow the same guidelines. So consistent data in census is definitely one. The other point is, and this is more technology focused, anything that has to do with data for products should be with the disability community. And there's an ethos in the disability community of nothing about us without us. And that's incredibly important, because data shouldn't be built without the disability community. And that's fundamental, because if you're building products, if you're building services, whatever you're building, and if it's without the disability community, then you are accidentally or unpurposefully excluding, 1 billion customers around the world. So those were some of the things that I think are pivotal when it comes to disability data.
Definitely. Would anyone like to add to her points?
I think mine's a couple fold, and I think I've been touching on this just a little bit, in the fact that one thing that we've seen as we've been talking to data aggregators, data companies, or companies that are using data, we've seen a trend, and probably my fellow panelists have seen this as well, where companies are fearful to collect some of this data because they're afraid, and they're afraid to hold on to it in any way, shape, or form now because of some of the things that have happened. And I know we'll probably get to it eventually, but talking about companies don't like instability, especially global companies. And if they are holding on to data that could potentially be sensitive, or that is ruled by a different government entity or body around the world, they're going to adhere to the strictest rules possible, which is good in many sense. But I think it's important for us to create some stability for companies, nonprofits, and governments of how to manage this data and work with this data, because as each of my colleagues have talked about here, data is important, but data could potentially have been used against a community in the past, and therefore it makes them fearful to go ahead and provide that data. So I think we really need to provide some structure and some clarity about how, through either policy or whatever that may be, federal privacy policy. I mean, here in the United States, you now have a patchwork of policy governing data, which can be really hard for a company to navigate. Not just a company, but an individual to navigate about what is being done with their data and how it's being used. To Dr. Morris's point, their community is really wanting to make sure that they're not providing data that could be used against them in any way, shape, or form. So I think that right now we have a big sense of fear, and we kind of need to calm that fear, and we need to work together to help calm that fear.
I'm really struck by the nothing about us without us. I have it on a sticky note, like right in front of me, actually, because in Indian country, we just aren't even, I mean, a lot of people think that we all died in the Old West. I mean, it's that bad. And we're such a small percentage of the population that there's just not even an attempt. There's not even an apology. It's complete indifference in terms of, and folks just don't even, and data, and if we understood we'll never have, how about this? We'll never have baseline data on who's connected and who's not in Indian country. We're not ever going to have that. It's too late now. So we're going to have a patchwork of connectivity, and such. We'll get through it. Some things are changing, but the reality is we just aren't even considered as being consulted. So that becomes, and so we're fearful of the data collection, but even the data that's collected in census isn't granular enough for us to use in some of these situations. The zip code tract isn't even granular enough in a lot of our communities. And so, it's complete indifference, complete ignoring, and especially if it's a company that's not no interaction, maybe East Coast don't want to pick on the East Coast, but a lot of East Coast folks don't even think they're still Indians. I mean, I still hear it. I did a stint at the Smithsonian years and years ago, and they were like, "You're a real Indian?" Like, yeah, you know. And also, folks don't know we're just around them every day. I don't look Indian. There's no way. We don't look a certain way because it is both the way the data has been used against us to annihilate us statistically, to the fact that we're not even considered in developing policy or monetary policy. I mean, we've just gotten recognition by the Treasury, which has been a huge, huge impact since COVID and such, but never thinking about the banking industry or the fact that we can't collateralize loans on our lands and things. There's so many ways that we're not thought about in terms of the data as a part of the population. So nothing about us without us. It's a biggie. I like that.
I wanted to build off something that Chris said in terms of the fear of collecting data, specifically around race. I mean, that's some of the things I've been hearing, you know, in the financial services industry, because what happens is if that information is collected, you know, banks may be fearful that they can be accused of discrimination because they're using that data to make decisions or, you know, provide specific services for that community. I mean, personally, I think it's important to gather that information so you know who your consumers are and how to best develop for them. But at the same time, I think it gets to something that Chris said in terms of, you know, providing information and principles, guardrails, guidelines for how this should be collected appropriately. I think the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is, you know, one example of an agency, specifically as it relates to financial services, that tries to provide those kind of guidelines there. But we should, you know, I think there needs to be more conversations and opportunities for several, you know, different kinds of companies to understand the importance of collecting that kind of data, to be able to assess, you know, how their technologies are operating. And so just wanted to throw that out there as being very important, getting the kind of guidance from public policymakers so we don't get in trouble.
Dr. Harrison, I don't want to take too much longer, but I do agree with you in the fact that there was just an article most recently about an African-American couple that their home was valued almost $200,000 less. And I think it was in the Washington Post and New York Times, but if people are interested to kind of read about how this stuff is working, go find that article because it is incredibly detailed and amazing. And
one more thing to add on what was collectively said about data availability, especially when it comes to tech. It's really important to have that data and to be able to share it, because one of the real life considerations, you're going to hear a lot from researchers and academia saying we require data. We need to have that data in order to build what we're beginning to research, to think of our, you know, Horizon 1 to Horizon 3. And without data being available and shareable, it's impossible for academia and researchers to be able to do so. So that's a really important consideration when it comes to all data as well.
Definitely. So I think kind of a theme we're talking about a lot is this sort of these attitudes surrounding data collection from a number of different communities, and kind of beyond these sort of the government downwards how-to directives of how to better collect data. What kind of outreach can really better help connect the government, tech companies, whatever, with these underrepresented groups to kind of increase their visibility, both in federal statistics, in private sector data? I'm kind of curious in how you think we can kind of build that more participatory relationship, maybe particularly for smaller groups such as Native Americans, or for groups where we don't know the scope, like the disabled community. Maybe Dr. Morris, could you start us?
I can. In fact, it made me think of something yesterday. I was reached out to by some folks at Amazon who's just started an affinity group for Indian country. But I think when these companies realize the buying power, when they realize the buying power of our communities, they're going to start doing data, because they aren't going to know what we want to buy or what we're, I think that will come. And so we've seen outreach into Indian country from Google, from Facebook, and now Amazon is reaching out. And Amazon had actually talked about how they're starting to create a program where they're creating an Amazon business for every tribal government enterprise, because our governments are also enterprise holders. We have businesses, not just gaming. We have businesses because we can't tax. We have businesses, and so they're realizing if they create accounts for all of these tribes and their ancillary industries, that's a big value add for them. That it's a whole market they've missed. And so I think as companies start to see that they can partner with tribal business, they can partner with gaming businesses, and they can partner with us as governments, I think that'll change. Money drives it, bang for the buck. But we are a bigger population than they realize. We did increase from 2%, I believe, to 5% in the last census. So we're not shrinking. And we're a young population. I think that will drive buying power as well. At least 50% of us are under 30. That's a young population. So there's a lot to be marketed to there. So I think once they realize, they will start coming around. And then hopefully by then we can enforce some good, data sovereignty policies and keep that in check. So.
I think it's really important to be working with organizations who are on the ground, working with communities, because there are a number of issues. First of all, and like we've talked about in terms of the collection of data, and particularly for African Americans, in ways that their data has been used and results in discrimination in the healthcare system. I think about Henrietta Lacks and how her DNA was used and is continued to use in medical research, but no credit, whether that is through name or financial kind of, given to her and her family. And so I also think about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, when the misuse of, giving syphilis to African American men and then no, kind of treatment after. So I say that to say that there's a lack of trust, right, in terms of taking the census, filling out other forms, or being a part of a study. And it's important that for the reasons for which the information is being collected, how it's going to be stored, why it's impactful for their community, that needs to be explained to people. And that happens when you have conversations and when you're embedded in communities. And so that kind of interaction with folks on the ground who have those relationships is important to get folks to understand the importance of perhaps even doing a national NIH study, right? I get those in the mail all the time. But in terms of just kind of going out there and thinking that someone's going to sign up because you want their data to be used for a federal program is not going to lead to a result where people are going to want to be a part of it. And so we have to think about trust as it relates to this topic, and getting more folks the information as to why and how their data is important.
And a complementary angle to that would be, again, I'm going to relate it to people with disabilities, is hire people with disabilities in all walks of life. Again, around government, around corporates, around nonprofits, representation drives a lot of benefits. And I want to see representation of people with disabilities everywhere, because you have a force of folks who are invested and want to drive that change. And unless you have them at the table, you're not going to have the right conversations. So hiring people with disabilities is key. Upskilling people with disabilities is also key. We talk about the talent gap in the industry a lot. How are we actually upskilling and making sure that the workforce is, where we want it to be, and we invest in it? I think those are items of important consideration around organizations and governments.
So I think we've talked a lot about, through all of your different answers, a lot of the fears and sort of the challenges that come with addressing these. And I kind of would like to move a little more into that, maybe in the realm of privacy and artificial intelligence. I'm kind of curious, maybe Chris can start us off, but I think that, privacy concerns have really always limited government data collection. How can agencies improve data collection in the public interest while still addressing these concerns? Sort of, how do you understand that what the balance should be there?
I'm going to go back to something pretty fundamental, and that is the United States has got to set a federal privacy law that not only agencies can follow, but companies can follow, and nonprofits can follow, because collectively, all of us working together are the ones that are able to really help communities. Of course, there's things in there like representation in companies, representation in data collection, and but I think you've heard all the panelists talk about trust. And so let me just back up a little bit in the fact that for 8 years, regardless of administration or wherever, we're nonpartisan, but for 8 years, we worked under the Obama administration to continue to excel the information collection and data collection around LGBTQ individuals. And what we saw in a change of administration was our data just disappear off agency websites, and it was gone, and us not knowing how it was being used or whether we would ever see it again. And that was a lot of work to then feel like we're then starting all over again. So this is where you've got some frustration of nonprofit entities like LGBT Tech, who are working in the grassroots communities, who are collecting data and working with communities to make sure that we're providing not only the technology and resources so that they can gain access to technology and be part of the technical ecosphere, but then that when that data is collected, that it's used in a non-harmful way, and it's used collectively to help improve the lives of our entire spanning community, regardless of if they span other diverse communities or minority communities. And so I think from an agency perspective, it's really hard for me to say agency should do this without this overarching theme of data protection and creating security for all communities, to be able to know how to play baseball, for lack of better words. I'm not a baseball fan, but or I don't play baseball, but you've got to know the rules in order to play the game. And if you don't know the rules, then you're kind of flying without any type of framework. And I think that's where we are right now. And I feel like agencies feel that, companies feel that, nonprofits feel that, and individuals that are working in this field are really trying to figure out how to combat this. And I think that our federal government has an opportunity to be the one to bring that together.
And if I can jump on that idea and thought, and it's also about, consumer empowerment. Do you understand the implications of what you're producing, what you're sharing, where you're sharing it? Do you have full transparency of your data? And I think data can be such a complex topic that it can be overwhelming. So how can it be simplified and make sure that every consumer out there has a clear implication of how they're interacting with their products, with their services, and that they are aware of how that is being used for and towards what end?
Definitely. So I'm kind of interested in that theme of consumer empowerment, but also I'm kind of interested in talking about not only the messaging, but sort of promoting an attitude shift about data as a tool to drive sort of positive change. Right now, we're thinking about it in more of a negative framing, and I'm kind of interested from maybe Dr. Morse or Dr. Harrison about how we can promote that attitude shift. How do we change the messaging sort of surrounding the risks, obviously acknowledging the very real risks, but how do we sort of help people understand that data can also be a tool that sort of empowers them to sort of either advocate for themselves medically or, other things like that? How can data how can we change that messaging? Dr. Harrison?
I'll take it on.
Okay.
So at the end user, we definitely need the protections like we're talking about. And folks need to understand what their data is used for, how it's used, and things like that. But from a governmental level, from a tribal governmental level, there's a big movement towards creating privacy protections at the governmental level. I mean, we all know that we have it at state level, we have it at the federal level. Tribes need to implement their own code for how to deal with data, especially the kind of data that's going to come, like specifically with broadband. That kind of data is proprietary to a carrier. Why wouldn't it be to a tribe? But it's not right now. There's no protections for it at the tribal level. So but we know we need the data. So we just put out a data paper. Actually, it came out this morning, and talking about that. And one of the things is tribes need to participate. We're encouraging tribes to participate in adding their own data to the network and then creating the appropriate protections for that as far as at the governmental level. So if we don't participate, we're losing that. Somebody else is going to monetize that. We should have the choice on whether or not to monetize that. But at the end user, it's a mixed bag. Older folks, just like in, they don't want to be online. Younger folks are online with everything, and I think it's so there's so many different constituencies and tribes and cultural considerations. It's a difficult thing to manage. What we try and focus on it in, the work that I do and with other allies is really just making sure that tribes know they need to put some codes in place to protect their data, but that they need to supplement that data if they want to fully participate as things change. And so that's sort of the approach that we've taken to it. And then tribes themselves can take on, what are cultural considerations? What do you not post on the internet about ceremony or whatever, things like that. But there's also there are already positives that tribes and tribal members have latched onto, like certainly the implications for saving languages. The technology is huge for that. That has been huge. Cultural revitalization of language through texting. We have emojis in my tribe. I've got tribal specific emojis. And so those sorts of things have been really terrific at bridging the age gap between elder and youngers. And so I think folks, 15 years ago when I was first getting started in this, we definitely had to talk about why it was important. Now we have to talk about protections. We know how important internet is. Yeah, we get that. It's how do you protect that data and how do you be participatory in the way that the world is going? I mean, I think AI is going to be a real issue. I hope we get to that question. But anyway, I'll stop there. Let somebody else jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something that Iona said, that it matters to have a diversity of folks who are involved in this kind of research process. And I think it's important because you need some type of cultural competence as you're going along doing the research. That means you need to understand the diversity and differences that a community is experiencing to be able to, ask questions in ways that connect to them, make sense to them, and are relevant to their lives. And I think by starting there, you are able to develop a relationship in which you can get that information or data from them and, explain to them, and you're able to explain to them how you're using it and why you're using it. So this is becoming really important in the work that we're doing in being able to have conversations with communities on the ground and in places that are safe. So not a text survey, not an online survey, because many people don't have broadband, right? But actually going into community centers, churches and schools, or organizations where the community, often visits. So I think that's important in terms of being able to gather that information and making connections with communities to be able to say, like, this is why it's so important. We want this information so we can better serve you, right? But only through understanding and highlighting the importance of cultural competency and research do I think that can facilitate that kind of process and good outcome.
Thanks for that. So I think before we get into audience questions, I have one more for the panel, which would be, there's so many different ways these divides kind of manifest. How do we set the priorities here? What kinds of things should we consider when setting these priorities for this kind of inclusive, data-driven future? I know you want to start off.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they need to be done in consultation with the community. I think any priority that's done without the community is not a priority, or it's a self-serving priority. So as we talk about the disability community, it has to be done with the community. There's a lot that they can share about their experience, about their needs, about real life examples. And I think that's incredibly important. So yeah, that would be my number one criteria, if you will.
Chris, do you have anything to add?
I do. I think government nonprofit companies really need to government, nonprofits, and companies, you really need to be working together to create equitable protection. I've said it several times here. But I think the second point that I have kind of brushed on, Iona kind of touched on this a little bit, but is I challenge especially individuals that look like me, white males, but everybody in the room, regardless of what position you hold and what you're working in, whether it's nonprofit, government, research, whatever it is, look around the room and challenge who's sitting at that table and make sure that you're asking the question. If you're the lowest person in that space, it's okay for you to ask, why don't we have representation from these particular groups? Because that is what's going to make a difference. That is what is going to change this field and ensure that everybody's represented. So I challenge everybody to be asking the questions of, are we including everybody? Do we have an inclusive representation? And are we doing the best that we can?
All right. So I think we can now move into some audience questions. Oh, you have something.
Sorry, I wanted to add, couldn't find the mute button. Just wanted to say, we haven't talked about it deeply here, but Denise did bring it up earlier in terms of open source data. I think that is important. The ability to use data sets based on data that the government collects to run studies across a number of kind of issues or topics. In the work that we do, we use a lot of data at City Ventures to be able to build products that meet the needs of communities. And so that data, for example, from the US Census, helps us on a platform that provides information about how to make decisions for place-based investments. So I just give that as an example to say that when you have open source data, educational institutes, nonprofits, individuals, advocates can run studies and develop research projects that really get to investigate problems that are big and that are also small. And so having that ability to access open data from a number of kind of industries, whether it's government and private companies, is really great in being able to dig down into other questions that we may not be asking, but another group has time and the bandwidth and capacity to address. So wanted to make sure that we got that in there.
Thank you. So I think for our first audience question, people are kind of interested in AI. And we have one that says, can we have trustworthy AI without closing the data divide? Anyone who wants to answer can jump in.
No, I don't think so. Let me just be frank. No. If you ever Googled American Indian or Native American, do you see what you come up with on the internet? And the stereotypes and the misrepresentation and the outright defamatory things. If AI builds off of what we've got out there, no, we can't. I once saw a presentation on AI in Indian country, and it was frightening to me what that could be. And talking about healthcare too, we don't even have enough healthcare data. I mean, imagine healthcare outcomes. Anyway, no, I don't. I don't know what the solution is. So I suppose the solution is more data, but I don't know if that'll solve it by the time the AI is in the space. How about that?
Anyone else want to add?
I would just say, a path to getting there is being able to have audits of AI. That is requiring companies or people who are using personal information to make decisions to audit their systems, their machine learning models, to see if there are different outcomes for different communities. And so in order to have trustworthy AI, we need more of those kinds of, guidelines that companies and organizations should be abiding by, so we understand the ways in which this data is being used in AI technology. I mean, frankly, AI technology is all over, it's being used in every industry to guide decisions for businesses, to, determine the outcomes for different goods and services for communities. And so we need to be thinking quickly and hard about how we're going to get to a place in which we have more fair outcomes in AI. And I think there are a number of folks who are working on that. But I think that's one approach to getting to a trustworthy AI system, is having audits in place. By a third party, by the way, not self-done.
And I would say, looking forward, I think it's important in this conversation is that the metaverse has been talked about a lot in recent, and so now you're not just using data points, you're using a lot of data points, visual data points, a lot more interaction in a space. And so, but the thing is to both Dr. Morris and Dr. Harrison's point, if different communities don't have access to the technology, then they're already not participating. That data is already not being collected. And so then we're already creating bias in an AI just by not being present. And so I think it's really important that, to Dr. Harrison's point, is audits where and to Denise's point in the opening, it's not just where the spotlight is, not just what you can see, but it's all of the dark around that you can't see, and really challenging in those spaces as well.
So for the next audience question, I think people are kind of curious about the future and whether this is a bipartisan issue with, elections coming up, and how the Biden administration, what Denise spoke about, a lot of great action is being taken. But where do you see the future going? Is this a bipartisan issue? Has there been bipartisan action in the past, through the past maybe 3 administrations? What do you think about going forward?
We've definitely seen data, like very basic data, like census tracts, where they have been used against other communities, or minority communities across the country. And so I think it's important to recognize that it's what data are we using. It is bipartisan. It is creating a lot of rifts across the country, continuing and deepening rifts. And I don't think it's creating as much conversation, helpful, healthy conversation as it should be, just because of a lack of understanding, a lack of coming to the table, and also a lack of just, it's not, there's us who work in this data all the time, or think about these things all the time, but what is the average person doing? I live in Central Virginia. I'm telling you, most people around here are not thinking about data collection, not thinking about AI. They're not thinking about the way that this is controlling their lives or the way it's pushing things. But how do we get them to participate? How do we get them to be thinking about this stuff? And I think that is a very complex answer that I can't give in the next few minutes. So I think we need to have a lot more conversations about this, but I think it's important to recognize that not everybody's at the table and not everybody's thinking about this in the same way.
I agree on that, but I also think that data in and of itself is biased by who interprets it. You always bring bias to every work you do. So in its very nature, it's going to be it's biased, and the kind of data, the kinds of questions that are asked, certainly. So I think it's not probably a bipartisan issue. It's a biased, data. We need data. We have to have data, but it depends. It is by its very nature is biased. So I don't think that it can be a truly bipartisan issue as much as we would like it to be. I don't have an answer to that.
I concur with you, Dr. Moore.
I was just going to add that I do think it's a bipartisan issue in that it's a topic that is of importance to both political parties, but the way that they're addressing it is different. And for example, like the privacy legislation, different sides have different ways of, tackling it. Do we need a separate agency that is going to, collect this information or provide, policies and regulations for how data is used and how it should be kept and stored? And so, like Chris said, it's a matter of coming to the table and what are the things that we can agree on to ensure that everyone's information is used in ways that are not biased and do not have unfair outcomes. So I think it'll continue to be on the minds of folks on the Hill because it is such an important issue.
Great. And I think for the last audience question, people are kind of curious, and I know this is sort of a US focused panel, but if anyone has any input on kind of thinking internationally, how the US can help address the data divide globally, what kind of global leadership is necessary? And then I think a really interesting part of their question is, are data divides a rich country problem? Is this sort of like not even something maybe lesser developed countries are considering, or should they be? Any thoughts?
I think they should. As of right now, I think it goes along the lines of if you don't have access and you're not participating online, you're not creating data, then you're not being counted. And that continues to drive issues. I think, and I'm not just talking from a US based organization. We are US based, but we've made investments into providing technology for LGBTQ asylum seekers around the world through some of our partners. And I will tell you, to Dr. Morse's point and to Dr. Harrison's point and Iona's point is that having understanding and listening to individuals and having them at the table and understanding how technology has changed their life, even some of the most basic technology, flip phones, having access to be able to just call somebody or get a hold of somebody, that technology is crucial and important. And the more that we understand, the more that we're able to, as the United States, work globally to ensure the inclusion and the continued adoption of technology across, the more information we will have, the more information will, and the better we'll be able to help each other, given given a lot of things in there that are not being said, and the fact that we have a lot of work to do to make sure that we're not biased, that we're working together. But I like to be optimistic and say that the more that all of us can participate globally, the more that we're working together, especially for like minority communities like the LGBTQ community. Some places in the world it is not safe to be LGBTQ, possibly punishable by death. We have an opportunity to work together as a very rich country to help and bring individuals along, get them connected, and hopefully start to create change on a global scale. I think there's a lot that we can do, recognizing there are challenges and there are potential harms that could happen, but we need to be aware of those and be working together to help ditch that technology divide and bring them into that space.
What an interesting question. I do absolutely think that the US should be helping to address the divide globally. But, and then the question of whether or not it's a rich country problem, absolutely it is. And internally, reservations are the poorest, are like third world countries, some of them. And guess what? No data. So yeah, it's absolutely a rich country problem, but tribes are part of this rich country and we're not even getting counted. Other communities are not getting counted. So I think it's more complex than a rich country problem, and like way more complex. But I also think that we should be leading globally. And but I don't know who's talking about it at that level. I have to say I haven't looked at the global level because I've been so embedded at the local level. So.
Yeah, I would say that, I don't know if we should, listen, I think that you can provide best practices and for countries and how to do it, but I don't think, for example, the US should be going into different countries and facilitating the collection of data on people. So I'll say that. And then in terms of the global landscape, I mean, we're seeing places like Europe lead in this area, in this space, with laws like the General Data Protection Regulation, right? Once that was passed, then all of a sudden our agencies and companies had to abide by that. That meant that we couldn't use personal information in ways that went against GDPR. And so as a result of that, then you now have states developing their own kind of policies around data and how you collect it. For example, California or other states as it relates to facial technology. So, I think that the U.S. can lead it in terms of an equitable and inclusive ways to use and promote data. But there are a lot of countries that have been thinking about this more intentionally and being able to pass regulation in ways that are quicker and kind of adapt to the technology as it develops. So still much more to be learned here on the ground before we actually go out to different countries and tell them what they should be doing.
Thanks so much for that. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. This is obviously a really important issue and there's so much more to discuss. And I want to thank our panelists for sharing their insights. And if you'd like to continue the discussion or have any questions or comments, please do feel free to reach out. And I look forward to continuing to engage with you all on these issues. Thanks.